As we step into 2025, one thing is clear. De-dollarization is not stopping, it's accelerating. China and other BRICS nations are scared of President Trump, and it's making them more determined to reduce their dependence on the US dollar and establish themselves as a global economic superpower. Their secret weapon? Gold. In fact, China resumed buying gold. And you know what's even more telling? They underreport their buy. Doesn't it make you wonder why? They recognize its global value and its ability to withstand economic shocks. Gold is a global asset with innate value. It's tangible, reliable, and it's immune to economic manipulation. China and other BRICS countries want to be prepared. They just don't want it to be known. But this isn't about nations. It's about you. In a world of shifting economic power, gold is your personal hedge against uncertainty. That's why Noble Gold Investments can help you secure your financial future with gold. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com today to learn more. And with a qualified account, receive 10 1-ounce silver American Eagle coins. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. And remember, there's always a risk of investment and there's no guarantee of any kind. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. We have once again with us good sir, Mr. Alastair Macleod, who will be joining us on our monthly symposium to talk about all things financial, both here stateside as well as throughout the whole of the world. And we'll be getting his musings on these different subjects. As always, if you are new to the podcast, please do like, subscribe, and share so that others can gain in the knowledge you're being afforded. As you know, for those of you who've seen it, Mr. Macleod before, he is an avid financier with a plethora of history in the financial services world since 1970. He's got his finger on the pulse of the banking financial institutions. And he also has the overseas global aspect to give us a balanced perspective. So with all that said, Alastair Macleod, once again, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure.
When you say how you're doing, I've actually got a bit of a cold, but I'll try not to cough too much.
That's okay. I understand. You know, here in the Los Angeles area, we're still dealing with I guess you could say the offshoot of the fire situation. So it's made the air quality somewhat compromised.
Yeah, and smoke.
Yes. Well, yeah. Fortunately, where I am, we haven't bared the brunt of that, but you get the after effects, which definitely affects the, air quality. So day to day, you're kind of not sure, depending on the winds, how it's going to be, but sure. We persist. So, our prayers and thoughts are certainly with the people 20 plus miles north of me.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, it must be terrible. It really must be terrible for them.
It's unprecedented in many ways, And, we just have to, work together and endure and overcome. So
it got a mention in Trump's inaugural speech.
Funny you mention that because
it's interesting, yeah.
Well, it's funny you mention that because that was actually perfect segue to my first question with you, Alastair. So let's start with that. We've just had a very exciting and historic inauguration of President Trump, as you know. We're talking on the podcast today. And he's planning on activating at least 100 executive orders here shortly to include the nation of Iraq, which will experience a major revival and revaluation, as well as XRP being the staple coin of the blockchain on the BRICS platform, which we've discussed before. And he seems pretty serious and intentional and resolute about making good on these matters. So I will start with that. What are your thoughts?
Well, are we talking about blockchain or what?
Well, BRICS, blockchain, everything.
Yeah. Well, I would say that he is, I'm afraid, rather ignorant about the situation with cryptocurrencies. And I think as his administration progresses, he will be put right, I think, by the Fed in particular, that in order to promote, if he wants to promote a cryptocurrency, then actually the risk is that he'll undermine the dollar. The idea, I mean, there's so much chatter going on about cryptocurrencies and all the rest of it. I mean, I saw actually at one stage today, Bitcoin got up to 108,000, something like that. I mean, new high. It was all terribly exciting. So everybody's getting very, very excited about it. But actually, I think this is probably peak Bitcoin. A bit dangerous saying that, but all the good news is in there now. I think purely from an emotional point of view. And I think this is a subject which is actually going to quietly disappear from the headlines.
What about the fact, though, Alastair, with Doge removing a lot of the government waste and the fact that he's now changed it from the IRS to the External Revenue Service with tariffs? That seems to kind of counteract what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, with Doge, I think that it's going to be a lot more difficult for Doge than the very nice idea that these bureaucrats are just spending money and we need someone to get in there and stop them spending money. I mean, that's not actually how government works. And furthermore, the established bureaucracy will be extremely resilient when it comes to resisting the intervention of Doge. And in any event, these things are decided in Congress, not in a department like Doge, really not. So I think that if I was Elon Musk, I think I'd probably within about 6 months decide, well, you know, perhaps I could do some good, but really I'm just wasting my time here. I mean, we had a similar situation in the UK with Dominic Cummings, who was coming at it slightly differently, but he basically wanted to take the civil service by the scruff of the neck and reorganize it so that it would actually deliver cost effectively, and that way, cut down bureaucracy, cut down the expense of government as well. And the establishment saw him off. And this I think. So my default assumption on this is that Doge will not achieve its objectives.
Well, I hear what you're
So
saying,
that's
Alistair.
Doge. That's Doge.
Right, right,
Sorry.
right. No, that's fine. I was just letting you kind of articulate your point, but
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, Alistair. But at the same time, to your point, he has a majority of the House and the Senate on his side now to implement things, whereas his first term he did not. So maybe the momentum's a little bit different now. We'll have to see.
Well, undoubtedly that's true. I mean, we've got a far wiser Trump second time round than we had first time round. But it's all very well sort of thinking that the Republicans in the House are behind him. But when it comes to actually interfering with the legislative process, I think that it's going to be a slightly different matter. I mean, watch that space very, very
Right.
carefully. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's why
Uh,
we're talking about it. We'll have to see how it all plays out, but it's certainly very, very interesting,
yeah.
unprecedented territory. Last week, Alistair, as you're probably aware, I thought this is an interesting sort of development. I had asked this to some of my other guests, so I wanted to sort of take your proverbial temperature on it, and that is that 10 major financial institutions, including Wells Fargo, BOA, JP Morgan Chase, BlackRock, State Street, and many others, have capitulated and seemingly done an about-face in terms of removing themselves from the NZBA or the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which, as you know, denotes the climate change agenda. Does this
Yeah.
surprise you? And does this signal an about face for the removal of the carbon tax agenda, at least in America? And what implications might that have for Europe?
I think you've actually hit on probably one of the most important subjects and developments under Trump, because with essentially a deeply socialist approach in Europe, the whole of this climate change agenda has been really a socialist thing, turning that on its head. And very, very quickly, I find it's not just the banks and the institutions that you mentioned which will turn around in this. Whole countries will turn around. I mean, if you look at the UK, for example, we have got the most stupid program of decarbonisation you can imagine. I mean, basically, it means electricity is going to shut down. The gap cannot be bridged. At the moment, we've had no wind and cloudy skies for the last fortnight. And the result is that our natural gas levels have run down to almost crisis levels. I mean, this is just ridiculous. It is crazy. And this is before the full impact of transport electrification comes in. Basically, they're killing this country. I think that Trump's move away from this decarbonisation, whatever, this environmental stuff, I think is desperately important. It's actually going to save us, I think, from a gathering crisis. And it's not just America, but it's also many other nations as well. And you'd be surprised, I think we'll all be surprised, at how previously supporters of doing away with the cost of fossil fuels and all the rest of it will switch like that. They'll turn around because it's in their interest to do so. These are basically, sort of, if you like, idiot followers who, and particularly companies. I mean, companies, it's just extraordinary. This whole thing in the UK, you've got companies who support fossil fuel, they're sort of doing away with this fossil fuels. They also support there's all this woke stuff. I can't believe they really believe in it. And all they need is a lead in the other direction, and they'll just go in the other direction. And I think that is one of the greatest gifts that Trump actually can give the rest of the world. He's doing it. The other thing he's promised to do, which I think is absolutely right, is drill, baby, drill. Frack, frack, frack. I said that very carefully. Frack, frack, frack.
Right. No, I followed you.
And good for him, because that will at least impact on oil, particularly I think after this winter is out of the way. I think that's very, very good for us all. And I mean, we've got undoubtedly inflation problems, and you mentioned tariffs, and we must come on to that subject. But I really do see that inflation is going to be the big problem in the first year or two of his term, and that, of course, means that interest rates cannot actually decline. And there's still expectations in the market of a decline in interest rates. I mean, I think the sort of the indications are that the market expects one cut in 2025, maybe in the third quarter. I don't think they're going to get that at all. If anything, interest rates and bond yields are going the other way, and
Hmm.
that's crucial. That is absolutely crucial.
I've heard others opine that, so I comprehend what you're saying. And I think, to your point about drilling, he talks a lot about a lot in duality, Alastair, when he speaks. There's like a multiple message or double entendre with respect to drilling liquid gold under our feet. He said it today at the inauguration. I think he's referring to not just oil, but actual physical gold, and
Yeah.
returning back, the gold standard, which will, I think, kill the Fed dollar, which is what he's aiming to do in order to return the gold standard. So I think we think there's multiple parts at play. So thank you for your articulation there. Staying with Europe a little bit, a counterpart, which I would believe would be to your southeast, if I'm not mistaken, as you're well aware, referring to Germany, their economy is on the brink of collapse and utter ruin. And certainly, as you said, they're not alone. Clearly, the net neutrality green initiative isn't working, and deep down they know it. So staying on that subject for a minute, what do you see for the future of Germany and other nations if they do persist in this manner?
Um, well, I think, unfortunately, I think they will persist in this manner. It's not good, is a short answer. The political situation is evolving. AFD, which is they sort of call it the right-wing party or whatever, but actually they're libertarians more than socialists. I mean, let's just get one thing straight. When you're talking left-wing and right-wing, you're talking basically communism and fascism. The communist wing, the sort of Christian socialists, the social democrats, and all the rest of it, always talk about the right wing as if they're fascists. This is not the case with AFD. AFD basically are free marketeers. And of course, Brussels hates this. It goes completely against the centralized government in Brussels, which runs the European Union and is meant to be the glue that holds the whole thing together. We are seeing political change. And I just hope from Germany's case that, the AFD managed to really do something in the elections, which I think is something like February, March in Germany. And I mean, I think that would be great. It would drive a huge, great wedge within the European Union. And France, of course, has also got the position of no government at the moment. I mean, they're in crisis. So there's a huge, great change going on, John, in terms of politics. And the outlier in this actually is Britain. I mean, we've just elected the most socialist government you can possibly imagine. I mean, it is communist.
Yeah.
They are trying to, I mean, basically, they have the politics of 1930s far left socialism. I mean, it's literally that. And they're talking about renationalizing the railways.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about enhancing the state because they don't like the private sector. But hold on a minute, we've got to have the private sector to pay the taxes, sort of thing. So they're trying to persuade BlackRock and sort of Larry Fink and all these sort of big money guys to come and invest. And Rachel from Accounts, as she's now called, she's going to be in Davos this week, trying to persuade all these guys, the banks, Jamie Dimon, the lot of them, to come and invest in Britain. But she just went before she was elected. She was saying, we're on business's side. We're going to make sure that the environment is good for business. And then she introduced taxes, which clobbers business. So she's going to go along and talk to people who have seen her performance. It's not going to cut any ice. It really isn't. Unless it's really in their interest. And the way you work socialists is basically you bribe them. And that's what these guys are going to do.
Mm.
I can see Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon and head of Goldman Sachs, whoever he is nowadays, turning around and saying, well, what's in it for us? And unless there is definitely something in it for them, they won't play ball.
Yeah, exactly. That's a zero-sum game, Alistair, to your point with double standards, a glut, you could say. But it's clearly why I think President Trump has pulled us away in America from England. And if you noticed, he talked a lot about today. I don't know if you saw the inauguration, but he talked about the Republic, which is clearly pulling away from the British influence of the past, which I think is also, to your point, very significant.
Yeah.
Staying again overseas, and this is of a personal interest story for you, as we first talked about in our first podcast together with your African or South African roots. Was very curious to get your take on this, Alastair, quietly but steadily. Again, I don't know how much familiarity you have, or you may, we'll find out, but Nelson Chamisa continues to make strident efforts in restoring Zimbabwe's fortunes once he comes back, both for the people of Zimbabwe as well as the whole of the world. So with that being said, what are your impressions of his restoration as their leader of Zimbabwe coming back to prominence? Is there a sense of any pride for you personally for the country of Zimbabwe as well as the continent of Africa for that matter?
Well, I must admit, I haven't been following the ins and outs of Zimbabwe. It wasn't actually, anywhere near where I lived in Africa.
Sure.
We were in Kenya and the northern end of Kenya at that, close to Uganda. I mean, I've got a sort of a general overview of Africa. And to my mind, Zimbabwe has been really a tragedy. It was an extremely wealthy country under the British, and we tried to give them independence, but the white settler community resisted it. And the result is that you had, a deal was done with Robert Mugabe by Mrs. Thatcher, and a tyrant was elected. And the country basically has just gone from bad to worse. We've seen the Zimbabwe currency absolutely collapse. We have seen them try to sort of stabilize the currency, but they never quite do the right thing. There's something, and I haven't followed it. And I mean, they were talking about a new gold coin or something, but this is the sort of thing which would never get into issue, I guess. It's a sort of an empty promise, let's put it that way. I think that's probably the way to look at it. I mean, it's a tragedy. There's so much of Africa which is like this. I mean, South Africa is a tragedy as well. It really is. I mean, the level of unemployment is absolutely enormous, and lawlessness is huge. I certainly wouldn't take my wife, let alone family, if I had children or grandchildren, let's say,
Right.
out there, without being part of a guarded party. I mean, it's just too dangerous. Johannesburg is very dangerous. It really is. I mean, even Cape Town, which has been sort of pretty good in the past, has got some spots which you would not go into at all. Africa, I'm afraid, is a tragedy. It is recovering from that tragedy. It's a bit of a slow process, but it does mean, I think, that a lot of the economic development around the world is actually going to be centered on Africa. And this is part of the BRICS story, really. And this is why they're being very much included, if you like, as trading partners for the Asian hegemons. And partly also because, of course, they've got huge natural resources, which China in particular wants.
Yeah, firstly, Alastair, I concur with you that it has been a how to characterize this Greek comic tragedy of the worst kind.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're seeing a lot of corruption here in America being ferreted out, which we believe in our team will have a domino effect, if you like, overseas. To the point of your question, the question I was asking you, and a couple with BRICS, and I think President Trump is going to be working with Chamisa to remove the aforementioned corrupt Mingawa that you mentioned, to bring a sense of nationalism and restore that country back to the gold promise they have. One of the encouraging signs, if you recall, we saw last year was China, I believe it was August last year, wanted to invest 300 million within the precious minerals mining market within Zimbabwe, and they said flat out no and declined, which I was very encouraged by, to your earlier articulation. So those, I think, bullet points are what give us encouragement for Zimbabwe to really break free, and maybe in a quicker fashion than we know, with the aid of Chamisa, who is, by the way, an ardent Christian, who wants to, desperately bring that country back to prominence. So it'll be exciting to see how that, to your point, sort of plays out. Staying a little bit overseas, at least from this vantage point, this will be my last question for you on your home front, my / overseas front. Interesting development, as you're probably aware, Alastair, we talked about this a little bit before. Japan seems to be cozying up to Indonesia as they joined BRICS recently, along with 10 other countries, and there's 25 in tow. So we see the sort of the peacock effect of BRICS expanding out in a good way. Also, not to mention, Alastair, that Pakistan has recently discovered over 2 billion in gold reserves, as well as Nayib Bukele, the sterling president of El Salvador, has recently announced that they've discovered gold reserves in excess of $3 trillion. So with that being said, does it look to you like that maybe Japan is going to join BRICS at some point, possibly sooner than later?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Japan is very, very much in the American camp. It is particularly a US partner. And sorry, excuse me. I just don't see Japan moving away from that. Japan, I think, in terms of international relations, I think would just keep very, very quiet. I think her interests in Indonesia are less at the government level, but more at the commercial level. I mean, I think the big Zaibatsus, who effectively, the big corporations which run Japan, I mean, they're interested in Indonesia. I mean, it's got huge resources. It's a big population. I think it's in the G20 now. I mean, this is, it is a very, very large, populous, and rapidly growing country. So yeah, I mean, and it's in, it's on the Japanese side of the Pacific. So excuse me. Sorry about this cough.
No, it's okay.
Yes. So I mean, I think it would be a bit premature to sort of say that this is really significant, other than just purely in terms of trade. I think both are members of the is it the Asia Pacific trade
Mhm.
thing, along with America actually. So I think that I think it's all about trade rather than BRICS as such. Now, having said that, an earlier prime minister used to attend BRICS conferences, going way back, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization conferences. Um, uh, so they've had this sort of sort of eye, if you like, on the Asian mainland, which makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, if you've got China over there, which has really been rapidly industrializing.
As we enter 2025, de-dollarization is accelerating. China and BRICS nations are reducing their dependence on the US dollar, and their secret weapon, gold. China's buying gold, quietly underreporting their purchases. Why? Because they know gold's global value, its ability to withstand economic shocks, and its immunity to manipulation. This isn't just about nations, it's about you. Gold is your personal hedge against uncertainty. Noble Gold Investments can help you secure your financial future with gold. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com now, and with a qualified account, receive 10 1-ounce silver American Eagle coins. Remember, there's a risk of investment, and there's no guarantee of any kind.
Becoming a very, very powerful force in its own right, teaming up with Russia and so on. I mean, if I was just offshore from all that, I would want to be watching it quite carefully. I would want to be, sort of cozying up to them and saying, it's lovely to see you and all the rest of it. And I think that's basically what they've been doing. Yeah. But they don't want to upset the Americans. I think this is an important point. And
Right.
as to tariffs, I think by keeping their heads down, they hope that Trump won't hit them. Trump, I think, is really going for China, and he's also going for the EU. Japan's motor manufacturing business, however, is likely to suffer perhaps, I don't know, 10% tariffs, extra tariffs, something like that.
Mhm.
So, but that's I think that the tariff thing is actually terribly important, and that's a subject which I think we ought to discuss too.
Sure, certainly. I comprehend your point, Alistair, about Japan being a very strong ally of America for multiple decades now, particularly,
Yeah.
I think, since the 80s. I mean,
Mm.
for my limited lifetime on the planet, what I remember as a kid in the 80s is that they were a very strong sort of partnership, particularly in the automotive sector. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact, as you know, that Japan has been very quietly and subversively devaluing the yen, backing it with gold reserves, which is why I asked the question, because BRICS is making a very
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, John, I don't see them. I don't see them backing it with gold reserves at all. Not Japan. I mean, that has not come onto my radar at all. I mean, what we have seen is that valued in gold, the yen has been plummeting. But that actually is more because of the relationship between the yen and the dollar. And when you've got the Bank of Japan's deposit rate is 0.12%, the Fed's sort of rate is what 4.8 or something. I mean, what's going to happen to the yen? It just goes down the Swanee. And I think rising interest rates, which in my view are happening, and this is being reflected, if you like, in the dollar's trade weighted index, this rising interest rates, I think, and bond yields is going to make the Bank of Japan's stance even worse. They're just so out of kilter. So there is a bit of a tragedy, I'm afraid, developing there.
Yeah, well, that's why we have to just, as you said, kind of see how it transpires from this point forward. So thank you for that. Turning our attention back a little bit here on the North American side, a couple of things I wanted to discuss with you, Alistair. Here in America, Representative Massey is talking about HR Bill 24 and 25 being implemented to remove property and income tax. President Trump has the majority, as we talked about, of Congress and Senate on his side, unlike his first term, in order to implement this. As this goes through, what pressure does this bring to bear on the rest of the world, and what nations do you possibly see locking arms with a similar initiative?
Well, basically, as I understand it, what President Trump intends to do is to replace income tax and corporation taxes with tariffs. Now, obviously, it's not going to be a total replacement, but that's the direction in which he's going. Now, given that that's his policy, I think what he will do is he will bring in tax cuts on income and corporation taxes as soon as possible. The effect of this will be, I think, to maintain and perhaps increase the budget deficit, which is desperately important because it's the budget deficit which, in terms of extra credit in the economy, which is so inflationary. And at the same time, the effect of higher tariffs on imported goods, and given that China is probably the single largest involvement in directly and indirectly in terms of imports into the US for consumer items, you're going to see the CPI going up again, just purely on that fact. So you've got two things happening. You're going to have a big budget deficit in 2025, and at the same time, you're going to have tariffs. What does the Fed do? The Fed has got faced with rising inflation, and I mean significantly rising inflation, not just immediately as a result of the tariffs, but also in 2026, 2027, because the monetary effect is still working through in terms of the effect on undermining the purchasing power of the dollar. So the consequence, I think, of Trump's economics is that he's going to make a bad situation worse, I'm afraid. What that does to the dollar is it drives up the value of the dollar, which we're already seeing. I mean, in fact, the moment he won the presidential election, the dollar turned up, boom, straight through the roof. And that's continuing. And I think you're going to see it quite a lot higher. And this is going to put huge, huge pressure on particularly the yen, which we've just mentioned, and also the euro, because they are assuming that they can contain lower interest rates, keep interest rates suppressed. Against a rising interest rate and bond yield background for US treasuries, they've got no hope of achieving that. And it's going to be disastrous for them. So the whole of this sort of mishmash, I mean, you can see that in the case of Europe, not only is this a disaster for the countries in Europe which have very, very high government debt to GDPs, but you can see that it's going to undermine the European economy. Combination of tariffs plus all this going on, the tariffs will be aimed at the European Union. I mean, I think that's absolutely clear. So it's going to be very bad news. And if you look at the banks in both Japan and the Eurozone, the GSIBs, the big global systemically important banks, are all very highly leveraged, a lot more highly leveraged than the US banks, than the US GSIBs. So, we've got the potential of a banking crisis. We've got a political crisis. We've also got economies which are going to be driven into a slump. And I think there's a very, very severe risk that Trump's tariff policies, and he was mentioning previous presidents who was it McKinley who loved tariffs. The one thing that nobody's mentioned in this is the consequences of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. We're actually seeing something which could end up as a replay of that. And if you look at what happened from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was signed into law by President Hoover, it was that more than anything else, admittedly coupled with the credit crunch from the late 1920s, affected Wall Street, undermined Wall Street. It's a combination of the two things which really put America into a depression and the rest of the world, agricultural world as well. So, the consequences of going gung-ho on tariffs, I think actually could be extremely dangerous for all of us. I mean, having said that, I think it's bringing forward a crisis which was going to happen anyway, because really what we're looking at is an accumulation of credit, which has been, it's a result of bubbles which have just basically never been dealt with. They've always been, sort of caught, if you like, by the Fed, by collapsing interest rates, and then ensuring the survival of zombies and malinvestments, and pushing it into the next bubble. And so you've got this thing which has been mounting and mounting and mounting, and we now have the largest dollar-based credit bubble in history, and that's going to burst. And I think that Trump's moves, because of the effect on US interest rates, I think that's going to bring forward that bursting into 2025. And of course, this also undermines, everything to do with credit. And we're talking about equity markets, bonds, obviously, equity markets. We're talking about derivatives, and don't say it too loudly, we're also talking about cryptocurrencies.
Well, to your point, Alastair, we have been, I've talked to some other subject matter experts like yourself here in America. The real rate of inflation, the real rate of unemployment and GDP is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%, according to numbers by John Rich, who's sort of an expert on this. And so we've been in a depression since 2022. They just haven't said it for obvious reasons. So I think he's facilitating the old system off the cliff, if you like, in order to reset it, because we can't pay that debt back. It's untenable. It's in the quadrillions. We'd have to have gold and silver in the six-figure range to do that, and that would put it out of reach for most people to buy, and would mess with the margins of the banks as well, to your point. So it does seem to be going in a very inevitable direction. Short term rough, but in the long run, I think there's a lot of benefits that are coming on multiple fronts. So thank you for your feedback on that. Alastair, just a couple more questions just to respect your time over there. I know it's late. There seems to be a big push for Canada to be the 51st state of America. They have one of the largest land resources in the world, not to mention silver and potash and a whole bunch of other things, which would make an attractive offering for America and possibly Canadians seeking freedom from the oppression of the current Canadian British influence, especially in light of the recent resignation of Justin Trudeau. So I ask you, what's your insights on that?
I was hoping you were going to give me an easier question about Greenland. um, this is a tricky one. I mean, Trump is saying, I want Canada, I want Greenland, I want the Panama Canal. It's all very well in theory, but I think in practice it may not be quite so easy. I'm not sure that the Canadians would want to be another American state, and particularly from if you like, the politicians downwards. I think the politicians would resist it. They really would, very, very strongly, because they'd be put out of a job effectively. They become no more than say the governor of California or whatever. So you can see that instead of being a G7 country, and all this sort of stuff, no, I think they would resist it extremely strongly. There are a lot of youngsters in Canada who I think look at America and think, wouldn't it be nice to, I wish I was born in America. I think there's a lot of that. But I doubt really whether this would go anywhere. I really do. Greenland is more interesting because, as I understand it, the Danes have said, well, or at least one of the Danish politicians have said, well, it's up to the Greenlanders. And I would have thought that, I mean, I don't know, I have no insight really into how the Greenlanders and the Inuits would vote on such a matter. But I suspect that Denmark is in the position of being an absentee landlord, as it were, if I can put it that way. So there's probably not a very strong feeling of coherence with Denmark. Probably on the margin, they would probably go with, they'd probably vote to join America. So that I think is possible.
Interesting.
I don't know how I don't know how Trump is going to recover Panama. That's going to be an interesting watch, I think.
Well, I agree. I think that's why he's meeting with Xi for, among many other reasons related to BRICS as well, and what we've already discussed there is with respect to all those countries' sense of nationalism and currency revaluations away from the dollar hegemonies we've discussed in the past. I think that's part of the agenda. So it sounds like basically, in short, you feel more of a sense of optimism for Greenland and Canada, if I'm hearing you right.
Well, I don't know that that's optimism. I think optimism, as far as Trump is concerned, yes.
Right.
If he could probably get Greenland. Let's put it that way.
That's what I was. That's all I was ultimately driving at. So thank you.
Yeah.
And then the last question for today, Alastair, which obviously we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss, and it's sort of perplexed me. So I was very interested in today's podcast to ask you about this question, to get your temperature. And that is, as we turn our attention to the precious metals and oil commodities market, respectively, this is, of course, prior to the inauguration up to this point, we're seeing a slow but steady uptick in gold, silver, and crude oil prices. But all three seem to be poised to skyrocket here inevitably at some point. Are you somewhat surprised that they haven't launched to this point? And if not, when do you see them making their breakout point?
Well, I think that it has been consolidating. I mean, gold in particular has been consolidating. I think we talked about gold. I mean, silver, I think we can probably put on one side. It's very much influenced by gold, but the thing that really matters, I think, is gold. It's been sort of consolidating. I suspect that the Asian demand has been sort of waiting to get this election out of the way, and then it will make up its mind. But I think the dynamics behind it are that Asians understand that gold is real legal money, and fiat currencies are just credit. And consequently, the decision for an Asian in particular, and also central banks, I mean, central banks have been leading around the world, have been leading on this one, is, do we want to hold paper or do we want to hold real money? And, we make the mistake too easily of thinking that they're buying gold. Well, in fact, the emphasis should be they're getting out of dollars, getting out of euros. And I think that's the key to it. While the Chinese economy seems to be slow, whatever, or, if you talk to some people, they think it's probably in crisis. Look at it from the point of view of the household saver. The household saver has been chased out of property. That's no longer fashionable. Stock market is difficult, let's put it that way. They can't go and buy foreign currencies. They can't rush out and buy Swiss francs or something, which they might think might be better than the yuan. they've got bank deposits, and of course, interest rates are being cut so that the bank deposits, the rates on those have gone down. Um, the only other thing they've got, which many banks offer, are gold accounts, so they can go and buy gold. And I think that demand, particularly from China and to a lesser extent from India, I think is going to continue to absorb virtually all world production. And I wouldn't be diverted by claims, from various countries that they've found $3 trillion worth of gold and all the rest of it. I mean, I remember Uganda, was it 2 years ago, said that they found something like $8 trillion worth of gold, or something, something, or 8,000 tons. I don't know what it was just huge. But look, the earth in my garden has got gold in it, and it's not my gold. But if you sift it out, there's probably 0.0001 of a gram per ton of earth. I mean, it is everywhere. Let's face it.
Hmm.
The question is it accessible, and is it in quantities which are commercial? And the answer is, well, all these it's this is all pie in the sky until it's really proven up. And you've got politicians who will say anything about gold. I mean, do you believe politicians? I personally don't. Long experience tells me if a politician makes a definite statement, run a mile. But coming back to the gold values, I think that what really will drive it is a sudden realization that credit is full of risk. I mean, I've mentioned that we're going to get higher interest rates next year because of Trump's policies. I think unwittingly generating a situation which the Fed cannot avoid. They will have to put up interest rates. You'll see bond yields on treasuries rise as well. That will collapse the equity markets. It will also, bring about a lot of corporate disasters because you've got so many businesses around the world have benefited from low interest rates by taking out debt, which has got nothing to do with their production. They've just been gearing up on debt. I mean, the whole of the private equity industry has boomed on the back of zero interest rates. So, they're in trouble now because they're having to refinance. And so these higher rates are going to create real bankruptcies. And this is going to be a problem for the banks. And guess what? The central banks are all in negative equity themselves.
Hmm.
I mean, we have got a situation where the man on the moon, looking down on Earth, will say, credit has got an awful lot of risk in it. We don't want any credit. And that is why you get out of dollars, you get out of euros. I mean, the dollar is, as Steve Hanke is fond of saying, it's the least dirty shirt in the laundry. The rest of them are worse because we're all on a dollar standard of one sort or another. So consequently, dollar goes down, euro goes down quicker, yen collapses, sterling. I mean, with our socialist government, I mean, I can see it falling very, very significantly. So the whole of this sort of credit thing, I think, is going to suddenly appear to be incredibly risky. And so what do? You get out of credit. And where do you go? I mean, you can go and buy farmland maybe, but you've got to be a farmer. Buy property? Well, the problem is that the value of property is determined really by debt, credit, the other side of credit. So, that's probably not a good idea either. So what's left? Well, real money, real legal money, which is gold, whose purchasing power has been stable for the last 3,000 years. Demonstrably so too. So you can see that's the thing. You've got this sort of level standard here with everything else collapsing underneath it. What do? Get out of this stuff and go into the thing that's stable.
Right.
And I think that there's going to be a growing realization over 2025 that that is actually the only sensible thing to do. And it will mean that gold will appear to be far higher in price, whereas in value, it's not going to be that much higher. It's just that currencies are collapsing underneath it.
I see. Well, I do agree, obviously, that precious metals are going to be a very important safe haven for a variety of fronts. And to your point, Alastair, earlier on our dialogue, that if the U.S. is going to default on the debt, BRICS' entire thesis, if you think about it, right, is predicated on this.
I would say one thing. I think it's probably slightly emotive to say that the U.S. would default on its debt. I don't think that's how it happens. What we will see is foreigners who, on the margin, price US debt will stay away in droves, particularly along the yield curve. I mean, where they've got to hold dollars, they may well hold it, let us say, in T-bills, that sort of, 3-6 month stuff. But they're not, when it comes to out along the yield curve, I can see the 10-year US Treasuries yielding, well, first of all, they'll go through 5%, 10%, 15%. Where does it stop? This is going to be, I think, the real headache that Bessent, assuming he's US Treasury Secretary, is going to be faced with. I mean, it's going to be a real problem. And of course, the other thing is that there is a huge, great hole in terms of central bank gold reserves, and I think that hole is in America. I mean, we saw how reluctant the New York Fed was to return gold to Germany. Um, why? Well, they didn't have it, I think, is a short answer. And this goes in with all the suppression. If you go back to post 1971, the US Treasury was in the business of suppressing the sentiment around gold, saying, no, gold is now out of it. The standard is the dollar. That is the new standard. Well, forget gold, that's gone. And they would, first of all, they tried to chuck gold out into the markets, with offering lines of gold which were meant to kill the price. And I recall there was a case where Commerzbank took a whole 350,000 ounces off the Fed for an Arab customer. This was meant to kill the price. It just went like that. So, and ever since then, gold has been leaked into the markets through leasing in particular. So all you've got when you open up Fort Knox is you've got a bunch of IOUs from banks who took out leases and then never returned the stuff.
Mm.
And I think, there's a guy called Frank Van Rosso who did some very serious research on this, and he concluded in 2002 that somewhere between 10 and 16,000 tons of gold had gone out in lease. And as he put it, was adorning the necks of Asian women. So, as to America going on a gold standard, I think that's a very long shot. I just don't see it. But what I do see is as far as Russia is concerned, their economy is a lot better than anybody thinks. They could go on as a gold standard tomorrow. And there would be the benefit that they would stabilize the currency because it would become a gold substitute. And at the same time, they would lower interest rates from the current 21%.
Mm-hmm.
It would, because gold would just fly into Russia, because as soon as the ruble is a gold substitute, then the Russian banks, Russian institutions, Chinese institutions, Indian institutions go and buy it in the West, where the lease rate is 1.5% or something,
mm-hmm.
and you can get 20-odd% by submitting it into the Central Bank of Russia. This is money for old rope. It's an arbitrage. It's called an arbitrage. So you can see that Russia could actually do this tomorrow. China, I think, could too, but she's reluctant to destroy the Western financial system. It would be a nuclear event on the rest of us, financial nuclear event.
Well, that's go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. But I think if I'm right, and the conditions are developing for a complete collapse of this credit super bubble, which will basically take out Western fiat currencies, then at some stage, China is going to have to protect itself and say, well, either we go down with them or we stabilize our currency.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want to be blamed for undermining all the other currencies. So you can see there's going to be, I think, a moment when China is going to have to take that decision.
Well, that goes back. Thank you, Alastair. It goes back to my initial discussion about BRICS becoming a spiraling effect where the countries start to protect themselves against the uncertainty with precious metals, which would then in turn nationalize and back their respective currencies and everything that's associated.
So,
and we're watching, believe it or not, we're watching for the very strong possibility, in our humble opinion, that President Trump has always intended to defunct or remove the private Western central bank. And he would, in essence, be the third president in history to do so, as you know, Andrew Jackson being the one, which also sat on his left shoulder in his first term. So I think that was sort of a tell for his next term now up ahead. As we conclude, Alastair, I know you have a Substack, and we'll leave that in the description. Could you just briefly talk about that and what that entails, please?
Yeah, the reason I resigned from Gold Money was, I was really preaching to the converted, the customers of Gold Money, basically already converted, and I feel that there is a need, if you like, to educate a wider public about what is actually happening to the gold price, if you like, and make sure that they understand the difference between credit and real legal money. And so, I've made a big emphasis on that. And also the other aspects, the political aspects and geopolitical aspects and economic aspects. So really, I'm just trying to educate the widest possible audience that I can find. And I'm glad to say I've got quite a lot of followers in California, which is as a state. It's interesting because there you've got really sort of quite a socialist administration, but very quietly, an awful lot of people in California seem to understand the economic destruction which the socialism brings with it. So And I just want as many people as possible to understand this and protect themselves from what is becoming increasingly inevitable, and that is the collapse of credit in the form of fiat currencies.
Agreed. And we will leave that link, as we always do, Alastair, in the description so that people can query your work. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time and expertise. Pray you feel much better, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the near future.
I feel okay. It's just this damn throat.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you very much indeed for having me on, John.
Thank you, sir. Look forward to seeing you again soon.